Hi, I'm Nicholas, and I'm here today to talk about the impossible problem of consciousness, how to solve it, and what happens next. Now, you've probably never heard of the impossible problem, which is why I wrote this talk and made this presentation, but you may well have heard of the hard problem of consciousness and its somewhat related neighbor, the explanatory gap. So in the original statement of the hard problem, by David Chalmers, he contrasts the problem of explaining conscious experience with the easier problems of explaining, at least in his original view easier, every other human cognitive function and behavior in terms of conventional biophysics and or computation. Now, the explanatory gap is somewhat similar when we state it in the form of trying to understand how and why it is that certain neural states should be identical to, in one claim, or generate or instantiate, in a more general view, certain components of conscious experience. So the example examined in Levine's original statement of the explanatory gap was the relationship between neural activity in nerves called C fibers and the ouch experience of pain and the gap. The explanatory gap is the stark qualitative difference between these two kinds of things, neural activity and felt experience. Now, practicing scientists often, to put it mildly, kind of look down on these sorts of philosophical explorations. And so we could say that there's another sort of gap, which is a mindset or viewpoint gap, where many, but not all philosophers see a hard problem. Many, but not all, scientists see no problem at all. Or at least, as I'll explain later, these scientists simply see a real problem that's only hard in the way that all worthwhile scientific problems are. There's nothing special about consciousness. Now, one point I will establish today is that both sides of this viewpoint gap are in fact confused. And that confusion has to do with the context from which they are making their points or establishing their viewpoints. Philosophers are either wrong that the problem is hard in the context they're using. In that context, it's actually impossible, or they haven't really clarified their context. So the really hard problem for philosophers then is getting the context clear. Now, scientists aren't much better off, actually. So they have their context clear, but in that context, again, the problem is not no problem, it's actually impossible. Now, scientists could, based on the results of certain experimental tests which haven't been done yet, argue for a different context. And in that context, the claim of no real problem would hold up. So the central focus of today's talk will be to establish a clear context, what I call dynamically orthodox physics, or DOP, and to explain why, in that context, an experimentally based science of conscious experience is actually impossible. And at the end of the talk, I'll come back and explain how this result, the impossibility result, is a theorem in mathematical physics, not a personal view or philosophical critique. I'm going to come back and explain how this result clarifies the previous philosophical scientific standoff. Now, as I'll explain shortly, the impossibility theorem properly sits in a proto-scientific analysis of the methodological viability of consciousness science, an analysis which scientists and philosophers should have conducted in the 1990s when modern consciousness science took off. But before we get to that proto-scientific methodological context, I want to explain why one strand of scientific thinking rejects any idea that hard problems or explanatory gaps actually establish any kind of insurmountable problem for a science of consciousness. And so it's this scientific viewpoint, the no problem viewpoint, which really establishes and perpetuates this gap. Now, in one direction, scientists can reasonably dismiss, or at least strongly doubt, claims that the hard problem can't ever be solved. They can doubt it, for example, by pointing to previously difficult problems, which ultimately yielded to conventional scientific advances. And so my favorite example of this is beta decay. For example, when the nucleus of an atom randomly expels an electron and changes a neutron into a proton. So before the detailed understanding of beta decay, which takes place by processes completely distinct from what we could call typical functioning of typical atoms, we might have called this the hard problem of beta decay. But the standard model of particle physics eventually fully explained beta decay in terms of the weak force, which is mediated by W and Z bosons, particles that were unheard of, literally, before the 1960s. Then, concerning any allegedly fundamental problems stemming from an explanatory gap, my go-to in physics is the relationship of space-time curvature to, loosely speaking, the density and flux of matter energy. Now, these here are Einstein's field equations for general relativity, and they ultimately relate the motion of particles under gravitational influence, described by these so-called geodesic equations, to the curvature of four-dimensional spacetime encapsulated in the Ricci tensor R mu nu. And the actual curvature of spacetime is set, more or less, by this quantity T here. Now, this is a thing which expresses the density and flux of mass, energy, and momentum. So this is a super successful, hugely tested, fundamental and profound theory, but it has an explanatory gap. Density and flux of energy momentum and space-time curvature are two starkly qualitatively different things, apparently just as different as neural activity and the experience of pain are in Levine's original explanatory gap for consciousness. So general relativity doesn't explain mechanically how or philosophically why density and flux of mass, energy, and momentum give rise to space-time curvature. It explains mathematically how, and it answers why questions of the form, why this numeric curvature? Because this numeric stress, energy, momentum tensor. So in a simpler, although now outdated example, similarly, Newton's theory of gravity doesn't explain mechanically how or philosophically why mass gives rise to gravity either. So, but simply, explanatory gaps aren't necessarily fundamental obstacles. They are simply things that may or may not one day yield to further advances. Now, in a somewhat similar way, today's mainstream conscious experiential science is more or less ignoring the hard problem and explanatory gap critiques, stating hypotheses about the arising or instantiation of conscious experience of this rough stylistic form, and then going ahead to test various different forms of this general hypothesis class. This equation just says when brain conditions C for instantiation of a particular component of experience, angle brackets S sub x, when these conditions are satisfied, then that component arises or is instantiated in nature. I'll be explaining the angle brackets notation a bit more later. And you can take a look at this paper for the terms, in these terms in the expansion of the C conditions. But perhaps you can see that this approach, writing down theoretical possibilities and testing them despite philosophical critiques, appears to exactly parallel the beta decay, and general relativity cases. It simply strives to account for regularity and order in nature, regardless of remaining gaps, and without asking or answering teleological or mystical why questions. And this approach, at least conceptually, is what Seth has called the real problem, understanding how experience relates to brain-body state, analogous to the way we understand how space-time curvature relates to the density flux of mass, energy, momentum. So it's this overall way of thinking that establishes the divergence in viewpoint between some leading scientists and some leading philosophers. And it's this that apparently sets the stage then for full steam ahead on a scientific study of consciousness. But not quite so fast. When we try to introduce a radically different phenomenon into science, we should go through a proto-scientific stage, which involves making a tentative definition and then a robust assessment of whether a proposed experimental methodology involving that definition is viable, and whether the integration of pre-existing science with definition and methodology is consistent. Now, if viability and consistency of the total package are in doubt, we should loop back and keep tweaking things if we can to see if we can get to a viable and consistent overall package. And only if we can, and only if we do, should we then proceed safely to a truly scientific study of our original phenomenon. Now, unfortunately, what actually happened in the case of conscious experience was a failure to properly complete the proto-scientific phase. So effectively, we moved directly from a tentative definition into an experimental inquiry. And unfortunately, it happens that the package of definition, methodology, and pre-existing science that we've ended up with here is actually inconsistent and self-contradictory, which is why I put scientific in quotes here. So as we'll see, conscious experience is an impossible problem in the context that's being adopted for its mainstream study. And obviously, claiming to make real advances on a provably impossible problem is blatantly self-contradictory and unscientific. So what's the deal here? So I started with philosophical objections to consciousness science, and then examined a scientific mindset that seemed to advance very reasonable grounds, setting aside any alleged fatality arising from philosophy. Now I seem to be saying, after all, that philosophical objectors were right. But in fact, as I said earlier, I'm not doing that. Instead, I'm advancing a third view, which will clarify the philosophical and scientific standoffs, and which will finally fulfill proto-scientific prerequisites. So simply, there's a lot of scientific claims that beta decay and general relativity and the explanation of other phenomena, such as temperature, establish science's capacity to explain, predict, and control a host of different phenomena. But of course, the capacity to explain many things in that way doesn't necessarily extend to explaining everything. And the question of whether we can extend scientific explanation to conscious experience should have been what the proto-scientific phase of consciousness science took care of. So let's look at it another way. So beta decay, general relativity, and the molecular explanation of heat and temperature, these all look very different. The phenomena involved are very different, but they're all amenable to scientific explanations. This is a does not equal sign here. 3 does not do not equal signs. Now take the problem of conscious experience. So we have a matter tree and a matter brain in a 3D matter space. We have a conscious experience of the tree. There's greenness and blueness of the sky and so on. So the problem of understanding the tree-brain experience relationship certainly looks different again from all of these. So the question is, how different is it? Is there a different order of difference between the problem of consciousness and the collection of current scientific explanations? Is there a different difference here than between and amongst these different explanation styles? And if there is a different order of difference, is that different difference enough to obstruct scientific exploration? So as we'll see, there is a different difference for the science of consciousness, and that difference is actually quite easy to understand when things are framed properly. So all pre-existing science over here involves the relationship between numeric valued data information, length, mass, time, and so on. But consciousness science involves the relationship between those numeric valued reality features and qualia-valued data, greenness, blueness, again, for example. And so the veil referred to here is the epistemic veil. And this simply recognizes that what we see and hear and generally consciously experience is not the same as unseen reality in itself. And it's this unseen reality that all of pre-existing science properly refers to, studies, and explains. And everything, again, studied by science in unseen reality is ultimately number valued. Whereas, by definition of qualia, everything in experiential reality is qualia-valued. For example, the representative equation but the current mainstream approach to conscious experience relates a condition on numeric valued brain states to a qualia-valued label on conscious experiential components. Now, this observation about the structure of the problem is a different difference. That kind of difference isn't in any of these. But that observation by itself doesn't prove we can't have a science here. But it does, as we'll see, illuminate two different dynamical contexts. So in one of these, consciousness science will indeed be impossible, per the headline claim. But in the other, we won't be able to prove impossibility, which perhaps, with a little reflection, is the minimal condition for methodological viability. We can't prove it doesn't work. We might like to be able to prove it does work, but not provably impossible is the minimum. Now, some people watching this might be thinking, yes, I already knew that mainstream science couldn't explain the fullness of consciousness. But you're not really talking here to my concerns. Those concerns might be spiritual outlooks, or perhaps data that lies outside the scientific mainstream, things like telepathy or psychokinesis. Now, the standard account of consciousness is limited to reflexive, access, and phenomenal flavors. And the hard and real problems and the explanatory gap focus on phenomenal consciousness. Now, as I'll explain, the impossible problem strongly links phenomenal and access subversions. But as I hinted at just now, there are more stances with respect to varieties of consciousness than the mainstream matter-made brain-body view. And again, it may seem that the impossible problem is just going to speak to this mainstream view, albeit eventually you'll see in a powerfully transformational way. But it may seem that the impossible problem is going to neglect these peripheral, according to mainstream, subflavors, what I'm labeling now as MC, NC, and CC, matter active, non-local, and cosmic consciousness. However, as advertised, this talk will cover not just the impossible problem, focusing here, which does mainly talk to mainstream science, but we'll also talk about how to solve the impossible problem and what happens next after that. So after stating the impossible problem, we will move to something called the one experiment, which can experimentally establish the existence of a kind of matter-active consciousness. And this, in fact, is how the impossible problem is quote-unquote solved by such discoveries in the one experiment. When we then add in what I call the ignored problems, what happens next is the opening up of new conceptions of identity, including a linkage to cosmic consciousness. Now, I should emphasize that the green lines here are more in the nature of grounded, well-defined, and newly plausible explorations, whose scientific status still strongly contrasts with the rigor of this purple theoretical proof and blue discovery of new experimental data. So where we will end up is in a new beginning, the prospect for a genuine, meaningful dialogue between the wide variety of positions in and around consciousness science, but now in a truly scientific container, because the proto-scientific groundwork will finally have been properly completed. So here's how we'll cover all that in the remainder of this talk. In part one, under the heading True Consciousness Science, I'll develop that difference for consciousness science into a proof of the impossibility of consciousness science under dynamically orthodox physics. In part two, we'll discuss the one experiment, which is the way to solve the impossible problem. If a reality is actually dynamically unorthodox, the impossibility theory simply doesn't apply. And then in part three, we'll discuss what happens after solving the impossible problem, if we can, i.e. if our actual reality is shown to be dynamically unorthodox, as I firmly believe that it is. So this is where I will briefly discuss the ignored problems and their impact, and then the potential for creating a real dialogue, although the barriers to that potential arguably define a third consciousness-related problem, the dialogical problem of consciousness, to add to the impossible and the ignored.